The green LED on the proximity reader flashed twice, followed immediately by the heavy, mechanical thud of a magnetic lock disengaging. I pushed the reinforced glass door open, my rubber-soled shoes making no sound against the polished concrete floor of the startup co-working space. It was past midnight. The expansive floor plan was a cavern of blue server lights and sharp, geometric shadows stretching across the modern furniture. The ambient hum of the building's massive HVAC system pushed a constant stream of dry, over-filtered air down the long corridors. Everything appeared perfectly modern, highly regulated, and theoretically secure, except for the lone woman sitting in the absolute center of the room. Inside an office completely encased in soundproof glass, she was working late, but it was how she sat that commanded my immediate attention. Her desk was positioned awkwardly, shoved directly against the only solid structural pillar in the room. Her back was pressed perfectly flat against the drywall, eliminating any physical possibility of someone walking behind her blind spot. The overhead fluorescent lights in her specific cube were killed. She was illuminated only by the harsh, white glow of dual monitors. Her eyes didn't just scan the spreadsheets on her screens. They darted to the faint reflections on the glass walls every few seconds. It was the rigid, exhausting posture of someone who expected the perimeter to fail at any given moment. I paused by a row of empty standing desks, adjusting the strap of my heavy canvas bag. I didn't sneak in. I was carrying a clipboard with a signed, building-approved work order, and the vendor badge clipped to my dark jacket was entirely legitimate. I had swiped in through the front desk, logged my entry in the property manager's system, and taken the main elevator up to the fourth floor with full authorization. I walked toward the glass office, my steps deliberate and unhurried. She didn't hear me until I stopped directly in front of her door, standing in the pool of light spilling from her monitors. When she finally looked up, her reaction wasn't a jump or a scream. Her hands simply moved away from her keyboard and dropped flat onto the surface of her desk. Her jaw locked. She was terrified, but she was deeply, painfully disciplined. I kept my hands visible, resting one lightly on my clipboard, and tapped a single knuckle against the glass. I waited for her to process my presence, giving her time to realize I wasn't rushing the door. When she didn't move, I spoke, my voice carrying cleanly through the narrow gap in the doorframe. 3 deliveries came up here unescorted today, I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. And your door hardware is the weakest point on this floor. She stared at me, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, utilitarian knot that left her face completely exposed to the harsh light. The nameplate on her desk read, Daphne Ross, CEO. She was 36, the architect of a logistics platform currently valued in the 8 figures, and she looked like she hadn't slept a full, uninterrupted night in half a decade. Who are you? She asked. Her voice was steady, but the knuckles of her hands pressing into the desk were white with tension. Atlas Ward, I replied. I unclipped the vendor badge from my jacket and slid it through the gap in the door, letting it drop onto the edge of her desk, followed by the clipboard. Your sister, Palmer, hired my firm. As a co-signer on your lease and a primary investor, she authorized a full physical security review of your workspace. My work order is filed with building management, and my entry is logged on their system. Daphne looked down at the paperwork, her eyes scanning the official letterhead. She exhaled, a slow, controlled release of air, and finally leaned forward, peeling her back away from the concrete pillar. Palmer isn't the CEO. She had no right to order an audit of my floor behind my back. Palmer isn't guessing about the risk. She's the one paying the insurance premiums. I countered smoothly, stepping back a full pace to give her a respectful amount of space. She hired me because you requested a budget increase for private security escorts to and from your car. Yet, your physical office perimeter is failing basic compliance checks. I don't need to be a threat to walk up to this glass, Daphne. Anyone with a delivery uniform can do it. I gestured to the clipboard resting near her keyboard. I've spent the last 2 hours reviewing the building's infrastructure. Someone is already leveraging the gaps in this environment. She stood up, smoothing the front of her blazer with trembling hands, and walked to the door, opening it just enough to retrieve the clipboard. She scanned the top page, a formal incident report draft I had already begun filling out with my initial findings. It's not just the building security, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. She turned and opened the bottom drawer of her desk, pulling out a stack of heavy cardstock envelopes. She dropped them onto the glass surface with a dull thud. He leaves these on my chair. Not with reception. On my physical chair. Inside this locked office. I stepped into the room, my eyes sweeping the ceiling tiles, the air vents, the hinges on the door. Documented harassment, I noted, my voice devoid of judgment. I pulled a pair of nitrile gloves from my pocket and snapped them on before looking closer at the envelopes. No postage. Hand-delivered. Which means he either has a master key issued by management, or he's following the cleaning staff inside after hours. I've been alone for 6 years, Atlas, she said, wrapping her arms around her waist, an unconscious gesture to hold herself together. I don't go to industry events. I don't take meetings outside this building. I built a fortress, and he is still walking right through the walls. Who is he? I asked gently, though the context clues were already forming a complete, ugly picture in my mind. Walter, she whispered. The name carried a weight of absolute, soul-deep exhaustion. Walter Allen. He was my business partner before I founded this company. When I tried to leave, he used his leverage to strip my assets. I have a restraining order against him. She closed her eyes for a brief, defeated second. It expired 6 days ago. The courts won't renew it without fresh evidence of a physical threat. I looked at the envelopes. I didn't open them. I didn't need to read the poison inside to understand the structural failure of the room. I looked at the digital lock on her door, noting the standard, easily manipulated strike plate. You haven't built a fortress, I said, my voice calm, projecting absolute certainty to counter her rising panic. You built a fishbowl. He knows you feel trapped here. But that ends tonight. You were hired for an audit, she reminded me. Her tone defensive, a protective wall snapping back into place. You've audited it. You proved Palmer right. Now what? You tell me I'm unsafe and leave? Now, I said, setting my heavy canvas bag down on a side table, I become the only person available to fix it. My firm doesn't just write reports. We manage incident response. Starting with this door, for the next hour, I upgraded the strike plate on her office door and filed the change directly under the building's high-security tenant addendum. Daphne stayed at her desk, working silently in the glow of her monitors, occasionally glancing up as I systematically removed the physical vulnerability from her perimeter. I wasn't performing magic. I was following strict physical security protocols and legally logging every single step on my authorized work order. The physical labor grounded me. I didn't offer her useless platitudes about how everything would be fine or promise her the world was a safe place. I simply used my hands, my tools, and my authorized access to create a measurable, steel barrier between her and the threat. Try it, I told her, stepping back and wiping a smudge of graphite from my thumb with a clean rag. She stood up, walked out of the office, and let the heavy glass door swing shut. The new lock engaged with a heavy clank loud enough to feel real, reverberating slightly against the glass. It was a sound of absolute finality. She grabbed the handle and pulled. It didn't yield a single millimeter. Through the glass, I saw the rigid tension in her shoulders drop by a fraction. She looked at the new keypad mechanism I had installed, then up at me. I held up a single token. I pressed the button. The light turned green, and the door released with a soft click. I handed her the fob, making sure not to brush her fingers. You are the only person who holds this code, I said, meeting her eyes. Not the building manager, not the cleaning staff, just you. From this moment on, no one enters your domain without your explicit, physical consent. Daphne looked down at the small piece of black plastic in her palm. Her fingers closed tightly around it, gripping it like a lifeline. Walter is wealthy, she said softly, the fear creeping back into the edges of her voice. He sits on the board of the management company that owns this building. He uses policy and paperwork as weapons. He will try to mandate access. He will say these changes violate the lease. Let him try, I replied, my voice steady and compartmentalized. I was already viewing Walter Allen not as a monster to be fought in an alley, but as a liability risk that required meticulous documentation. He uses building policy. I use federal privacy statutes and physical security mandates. If he demands access, he'll need a court order. And that paper trail, will belong to us. The following Monday, I returned to the co-working space with my partner, Elliot, to begin the digital environment review. We were fully contracted now, our presence formally logged daily at the front desk. I established a temporary workstation at a small desk directly opposite Daphne's glass office. I was close enough to maintain visual contact and monitor the approaches, but far enough away to respect the boundary she clearly needed to feel safe. Daphne was resistant to the next phase of the security review. She sat in the small adjacent conference room with her laptop and personal phone clutched to her chest, her posture as rigid as the day I met her. "My personal phone is my last private space," she argued, her chin lifted in a defiant angle. "I run my life from this device. I can't just hand it over to a stranger." "You don't have to trust me yet, Daphne," I said, keeping my voice smooth, deliberately removing any edge of authority or demand. "And I don't need to take it out of your sight. But your physical security is useless if your digital perimeter is leaking your location. I just need to run a device check to ensure your phone isn't broadcasting to an unauthorized network." She looked at me, searching my face for any sign of a power trip, any hint of coercion. I offered none. I simply sat at the conference table and turned my monitor toward her so she could see the blank screen. "I won't open your messages, your photos, or your emails," I stated cleanly. "I will plug it in, run the check, log the results in our incident notes, and unplug it. 10 minutes. You keep your eyes on the screen, and you retain full control. If you say stop, I pull the cable." She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her phone case. It was a small concession, but in her world, where control had been systematically stripped away by someone she trusted, it was a massive leap. Slowly, she slid the phone across the polished table. Over the next 2 weeks, a quiet, methodical routine settled between us. The frantic energy of the initial assessment faded into a focused, deliberate process. I monitored the building's access records from my desk. She ran her company from hers. The domestic anchors of our forced proximity began to emerge, forming a silent, comforting rhythm that didn't require conversation. Every morning at precisely 8, the industrial coffee machine in the break room hissed, and I would find a fresh cup sitting quietly on my desk when I returned from checking the perimeter doors. Every afternoon at 3, the sun hit the western windows of the building, turning the office uncomfortably warm. I began to notice the small things. I noticed that when the temperature rose, Daphne would rub her left temple, a subtle, non-verbal tell of an impending headache. She would never complain or ask for help. She would just endure the discomfort, treating it as another inevitable hardship. I didn't ask if she was hot. I didn't draw attention to her discomfort or make a show of fixing it. I simply stood up, walked to the building's localized HVAC control panel, and dropped the temperature in her specific zone by 4 degrees, legally logging it as an environmental adjustment on my clipboard. A few minutes after the dry air cooled, her hand slid off her temple. She didn't thank me, she just kept working. And that was exactly the point. She didn't have to owe me for basic comfort. On a rainy Thursday evening, the office was empty except for the two of us. The severe storm outside battered the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the sound of the rain blurring the sharp edges of the city into a gray wash. I was reviewing a stack of building access records, my focus entirely on the highlighted timestamps and entry logs. Daphne walked out of her office holding 2 ceramic mugs. She set one down next to my paperwork without making a sound. It was black tea, steeped exactly the way I preferred, though I had never told her my order. She must have noticed what I chose from the break room pantry on the rare occasions I took a break. "You haven't left that chair in 6 hours, Atlas," she said, leaning against the edge of my desk, keeping a polite, safe distance. "The access logs require manual verification," I replied, setting my highlighter down and turning away from the documents. I picked up the mug. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into my cold fingers, a sharp, grounding contrast to the chill of the rain against the glass. "Thank you." She looked at the thick stack of papers on my desk. "You don't talk much about yourself. Palmer mentioned you used to work for a defense contractor, doing risk assessment." "Palmer reads too many of my old LinkedIn endorsements," I noted dryly, though a small smile touched the corner of my mouth. "But yes, I evaluated physical perimeters for people who made very large, very high-stakes decisions. "Why did you leave?" she asked, her voice quiet, genuinely curious. I took a slow breath, choosing the hardest, honest answer instead of a polished corporate response. Because I realized I was building walls to protect abstract entities, not actual people. The environment was entirely transactional. You secure the asset. You file the paperwork. You move on. I looked up at her, my gaze steady, meeting her eyes without crossing the invisible boundary between us. I prefer to see the outcome of my work. I prefer knowing that when I secure a door, the person on the other side can actually sleep. Daphne's eyes softened slightly. The ambient noise of the heavy rain hitting the glass seemed to amplify the sudden, comfortable silence between us. I saw the shift in her expression, the realization that my absolute rigidity and obsession with protocols wasn't coldness, but a structured, reliable form of care. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the incident notes on my desk in a gesture of shared understanding. I wanted to reach out and cover her hand with mine. The urge was a heavy, grounding weight in my chest, but I kept my hands wrapped firmly around the warm ceramic of the tea mug. I wouldn't blur the lines. I wouldn't make her safe space complicated with my own desires. Before either of us could speak again, the heavy, commercial printer in the corner of the co-working space suddenly whirred to life. The mechanical grinding shattered the quiet of the room. We both turned. No one else was on the floor. The printer aggressively spat out a single sheet of high-gloss paper into the tray, then fell completely, chillingly silent. My instincts engaged instantly. I stood up, gesturing with a flat palm for Daphne to stay put behind my desk. I walked to the printer, keeping my hands clear of the output tray until I could see exactly what had been transmitted. It was a high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of Daphne, taken from an elevated angle outside the building, looking through the glass of her office. But it wasn't taken from the street. It was taken from the rooftop terrace of the adjacent building, a secure area that required executive management clearance to access. In the photo, Daphne was holding the black tea mug she had just given me. The timestamp printed on the bottom corner indicated the image had been captured less than 4 minutes ago. I felt a cold, calculated anger lock into place in my chest. I didn't touch the paper. I pulled a clear evidence sleeve from my canvas bag and carefully slid the document inside, preserving its current state. Daphne walked up behind me. I tried to angle my body to block her view, but she saw it. A sharp, ragged intake of breath hitched in her throat. She stumbled backward, her shoulders hitting the edge of a standing desk. "He's here," she choked out, her hands flying to her face, her eyes wide with sheer panic. "He's out there watching right now. He printed it to our local network." "How?" I didn't panic. I didn't raise my voice. I placed the evidence sleeve carefully on the table. The building's print server logs show the sender was on-site close enough to pair to the printer network, I stated, my voice an absolute anchor in her storm. And the IT access records confirm the device registration matches Walter's corporate line. "I can't do this anymore," Daphne whispered, her composure finally fracturing into pieces. The 6 years of isolation, the endless vigilance, broke wide open. She sank into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands. "He ruins everything. When I left him, he used his connections to freeze my accounts. He threatened my reputation. I had to walk away with nothing and start over in the dark. And now he's going to take this sanctuary away too." I stood looking at her, the physical weight of her despair heavy in the room. The void in my own life, the sterile, transactional existence I had maintained for years demanded that I step forward. "Daphne," I said softly, staying right where I was, refusing to loom over her. "Eyes on me for a second. Just breathe with me. One in, one out." She slowly lowered her hands. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her breathing shallow, but she locked onto my steady gaze. "6 years ago, you didn't have me," I said, my voice low, carrying a steady, anchored certainty. "He used a system you didn't control to corner you. But this environment, I am documenting every inch of it." I stood up, moving with deliberate speed. I walked back to my terminal. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly less. "I'm securing the incident notes and the print server logs for the police report," I explained, pulling up the verified documentation. He thinks he's terrorizing you, but he just handed us a fully documented trail. I am sending this directly to my attorney right now. I saved the log file, routing a backup copy to our secure offsite server, and immediately drafted the expedited incident report. I wasn't acting out of revenge. I was securing her protection legally, building an undeniable, documented case that no high-priced lawyer or corrupt board member could dismantle. The next morning, the real retaliation began. Walter didn't try to intimidate her physically again. Instead, he used the exact weapon Daphne feared the most: corporate policy. At 10 a.m., a formal legal notice was hand-delivered to Daphne's office by a courier. It was an eviction summons from the building's management board. Walter, leveraging his position as a board member of the property group, had filed a motion claiming Daphne's company was a security liability that disrupted the safe environment of the co-working space. He specifically cited the physical modifications I had made to her door as a breach of the lease. The emergency hearing was set for 2 p.m. that same day in the executive boardroom on the top floor. It was a classic, high-pressure ambush. Daphne sat at her desk, staring blankly at the summons. The color was entirely gone from her face. He's using the building's bylaws. If I lose this office, I lose my secure server infrastructure. The company goes dark. He wins. I read the summons over her shoulder. My jaw tightened, but I kept my breathing perfectly even. I compartmentalized the anger, pushing it down into a cold, highly functional space where I operated best. He's relying on the board to be technically illiterate, I said, picking up the heavy paper. He expects you to show up unrepresented and argue emotionally about harassment. He expects you to look unstable so they can justify the eviction on paper. Daphne looked up at me, the defeat heavy in her eyes. Atlas, he owns half the board. He plays golf with the chairman. Facts won't matter. Facts always matter when they carry massive legal liability, I corrected, grabbing my laptop and slipping a thick manila folder into my canvas bag. Put your blazer on. Daphne, we're going to the boardroom. At 1:55 p.m., we walked into the executive suite. The boardroom was a sprawling expanse of polished mahogany and glass, overlooking the gray city skyline. 5 board members sat around the massive table. At the far end, leaning back in a leather chair with an air of absolute entitlement, sat Walter Allen. He was older, dressed in a bespoke suit, his smile sharp and entirely devoid of warmth. When Daphne walked in, his eyes followed her like he owned the room. He didn't. Not anymore. Miss Ross, the board chairman began, clearing his throat and adjusting his silk tie. We are here to address the unauthorized structural changes made to Suite 400 and the ongoing disruptions to the tenant ecosystem. I will be representing Miss Ross in this matter. I interrupted, my voice slicing through the polite corporate drone. I pulled out a chair for Daphne, waiting until she sat before taking the seat beside her. Walter finally looked at me, his lip curling in visible disdain. And who are you? A hired guard? This is a closed board meeting regarding a lease violation. I didn't look at Walter. I focused entirely on the chairman. I opened my bag and withdrew the thick bound dossier, sliding it precisely to the center of the table. My name is Atlas Ward. I am a licensed security consultant and the principal incident response lead for Miss Ross's firm, I stated calmly. I am here to formally notify this board that if you proceed with this eviction, you will be acting as accessories to a documented cyberstalking campaign, and my firm will hold the management company legally liable. The room went dead quiet. The chairman blinked, adjusting his glasses. Excuse me? That is an absurd accusation. I opened the dossier. I didn't raise my voice. I let the paper trail do the heavy lifting. Last night, an individual utilized this building's unsecured public print network to execute a targeted harassment campaign against my client. I slid a printed document across the table. My attorney filed the formal incident report overnight and secured an emergency hearing request. The judge hasn't signed the permanent order yet, but the paper trail is live, and the local precinct is currently reviewing these logs. Walter shifted in his chair, his smug expression faltering by a fraction. This is ridiculous. The board is not responsible for securing a public tenant network. You are responsible when a board member is the one executing the harassment. I countered, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of absolute authority. I pulled out a second sheet of paper and slid it directly in front of the chairman. That is the authorized IT log from your own building manager. The device that pinged the printer at the exact time of the incident is registered directly to Walter Allen. Walter slammed his hand on the mahogany table. That's fabricated. You have no proof I was anywhere near that floor. I turned to Walter for the first time. Actually, Walter, my attorney filed a formal request for the building's exterior camera logs this morning, and your property manager complied. I pulled out a glossy, time-stamped photograph, a still frame from the building's own security feed, and laid it cleanly on the table. It showed Walter Allen standing on the restricted rooftop terrace in the pouring rain, holding a phone, aiming it down at the glass windows of Suite 400. Mr. Allen used his executive override to access the roof, I explained to the silent room. He didn't just harass my client. He weaponized your corporate infrastructure to do it. I looked around the table. The board members were staring at the photograph, then at Walter, in absolute horror. They didn't care about Daphne's feelings, but they cared deeply about federal liability, police investigations, and public scandal. The modifications to Miss Ross's door were strictly compliant with emergency safety protocols, I concluded smoothly, gathering my files and tapping them into a neat stack. If you proceed with this eviction, my firm will name this board in the civil suit. Alternatively, you can drop the motion, and Mr. Allen can recuse himself from any future dealings regarding Suite 400. The room was paralyzed. I didn't wait for a response. I looked at Daphne, giving her a single, affirming nod. I had built the framework, but the final move belonged to her. Daphne stood up. She didn't look at the board. She looked directly down the table at Walter. Her shoulders were pulled back, her posture flawless. You don't get to control my space anymore, Walter, she said, her voice ringing clear and steady in the silent room. She produced a copy of the emergency filing confirmation from her own folder and dropped it on the table. Do not ever come near my floor again. She turned and walked out of the boardroom. I followed her, shutting the heavy mahogany door behind us, sealing Walter and his collapsing leverage inside the room forever. We walked to the elevator in silence. When the doors closed, the adrenaline was finally leaving my system. Daphne stood beside me, watching the floor indicator numbers drop. Her hands were shaking not from fear, but from the massive, overwhelming release of a 6-year burden. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a text from Palmer. Invoice approved. Don't leave her alone. We stepped out into the lobby. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily above us. It was over. The physical threat was neutralized, the legal boundaries were set, and Walter's reputation among his peers was permanently destroyed. We sat down on one of the long leather couches near the front windows. I didn't speak. I just sat beside her, letting the quiet settle over us. I noticed her breathing slowing down, the rigid lines of her posture finally relaxing into the soft cushions. It was a soft, necessary reset. My attorney confirmed the temporary protection order is active pending the formal hearing, I told her quietly, keeping my tone gentle. The local precinct has the logs. The building management has flagged his access card. He's done. Daphne looked at me. The harsh corporate lighting caught the slight exhaustion under her eyes, but the terror that had lived there since the night I met her was entirely gone. So, the initial audit is complete, she said softly. Yes, I replied, the word feeling heavier in my mouth than it should have. I was preparing to leave. I had done what I was hired to do. I filed the reports. I created a sanctuary. But as I looked at her, sitting tall and brilliant in the center of the lobby, the cold compartmentalization I relied on my entire career completely fractured. I didn't want to walk away. I wanted to stay in the space I had helped secure. I reached into my pocket and held out the temporary access badge she had issued me weeks ago. You should take this back. Protocol dictates I surrender access when the work order concludes. Daphne looked at the badge in my hand. She didn't take it. Instead, she made a deliberate choice. She reached out, her fingers wrapping over my hand, pushing the badge back toward my chest. It was a firm, undeniable contact, sending a quiet jolt through my arm. No, she said, her voice remarkably clear. Protocol dictates that the permanent head of security retains their access. She paused, letting out a small, breathless laugh that finally reached her eyes. Maybe Palmer should update those LinkedIn endorsements, she whispered. I don't want a temporary audit, Atlas. I want you to stay. Not as a file on my desk, just stay. She wasn't asking me to save her. She was making a calculated, powerful choice about who she wanted in her life, on her own terms, in the daylight. I felt the tension in my jaw completely release. I slowly turned my hand over, my fingers resting lightly against hers for a brief, quiet second before I stepped back, pocketing the badge. Contract accepted, Miss Ross, I said, a genuine smile finally breaking through my usual stoicism. I'll see you tomorrow at 8. I watched her stand and walk back toward the elevators, her steps light, her back no longer braced against a wall. The void of my own isolation, the quiet, sterile world I had built for myself. I stopped treating protection like paperwork. It became the quiet choices, warm tea, locked doors, and someone who doesn't flinch when the world gets loud. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.